Well, Pathway, let me ask you a question. Do you feel rich? Wherever you're at right now watching, I don't know, wherever you're at, maybe somewhere in the Middle Ohio Valley, maybe you're watching from an extended location outside of our region. I don't know where you're at joining us today, but wherever you're at today, I want you to take a moment in your heart of hearts to answer that question. Do you feel rich? If you feel rich, here's what I want you to do. I want you right wherever you're at, your living room, your car, your kitchen, around your kitchen table. I want you to just raise your hand nice and high if you feel rich. Well, I'm going to take a guess that of everybody watching our message today, that there was not a single hand that was raised in any home or on any kitchen table, in any dining room, in any living room where people are participating in this service, wherever you're at. I'm going to guess there was not a hand in the room that was raised. Isn't it interesting that we never seem to feel rich? I remember, I'm going to take you kind of on a journey of my life. I remember in January of 2005, I got my first job out of college. And I came on staff with a campus ministry organization called the Coalition for Christian Outreach. I was deployed, right out of college, deployed onto a college campus in southwestern Pennsylvania. And my starting salary, my very first year out of college, I'll never forget it, I remember it vividly, my starting salary was $20,000 a year. Now, up to that point in my life, I had only ever worked sort of like part-time jobs and hourly wages. I had never been in a salaried position. So when I came into my first job and I made $20,000 a year, $20,000 a year felt like a monumental amount of money to me. When I first got the job, just for a moment, for a short season at a time, I felt kind of rich because I had more money coming in than I'd seen before. Well, it didn't take me long to realize the limits of $20,000 a year. There were limits to the kind of car I could drive, limits to the restaurants I could go to, limits to what I could rent for an apartment, limits to what I could spend. I had limits all around my life. And in a very short amount of time, I realized that, I'm not really rich. Rich is sort of a mythical line, if you will, that's out in front of me. I don't know what the number is, but the number that I'm at is not it. I'm not rich. I didn't feel rich. Well, about 3 years into that job, I was working for the same organization, and I was given my first big sort of promotional opportunity. I was approached by one of the executives in our organization about taking over the training program in the Coalition for Christian Outreach. So we had staff on a couple hundred college campuses spread over like about a 4 or 5 state region, and I was invited to step into a job where I would oversee all the training events of our organization, run a whole bunch of events every year, and train our staff to be effective in college ministry. Well, I took the job, and when I took the job, I realized that my salary was going to jump. And my salary, literally overnight, almost doubled. I went to about somewhere in the window of $40,000 a year in a salary at that time when I took this promotion, when I took this position. I'll never forget when I saw what the salary was going to be for the position, that these thoughts ran through my mind. You ready for this? How in the world could I ever in my life spend $40,000 in a year? I've just lived the last 3 years off of $20,000, $40,000. That is rich. That is monumental. That's humongous. There's no way I could ever spend that kind of money. And so I picked my family up. I was married. I think at the time we had one child. A second one would be on the way soon. And we moved our family into the city of Pittsburgh. And I took this job. And it did not take me long, probably a couple of months, before all of a sudden I stopped feeling rich. And very quickly I began to learn the limits of how far $40,000 can go. There was a limit to the car, there was a limit to the house, there was a limit to the restaurants, a limit to the vacations, and I figured out a way to find what the limits were of that kind of salary. Well, I worked in that job for a couple of years, and several years down the road, another big opportunity came my way, and I was given another opportunity at sort of a step up, if you will, a promotional opportunity. I was invited by the leadership of our organization to move my family from Pittsburgh out to somewhere in the Indianapolis area, and to become, I had this big flashy title of the Indiana Director, and my job was to get ministry started all over the state of Indiana. This was the first time that I was really going to be in a managerial role. I had done a little bit of management up to this point, but now I was going to be in a job where I was going to be managing a team of staff, that everybody that we would hire to work on a college campus in Indiana was going to fall under me and ultimately report to me. And it was another step up, and the step up came with another salary increase. I remember when I saw the salary increase, I thought, are you kidding me? How could I ever spend that kind of money? There's no way I could ever spend that kind of money. And then I got into the role. I got the promotion in 2010, and I remember somewhere around the time frame of sort of 2013, 2014, my family had grown. I was living in a really beautiful home in the suburbs of Indianapolis, driving a nice car, had a job that I loved, making a salary that was bigger than anything I'd ever had in my life. And I remember being struck with this thought. Here it was, let's say it was somewhere around 2014. I'm struck with this thought. If I could take a snapshot of my life today, the income that I make, the house that I live in, the car that I drive, the family that I have, and if I could have taken a snapshot of that and taken that back in time 10 years, back to 2004, 2005, when I first came into a job with this organization, and I could have said, hey, 10 years down the road, this is what life is going to look like. The 2004 version of me would have looked at it and said, that is astonishingly rich. That is astonishingly rich. The guy who was making that entry-level salary would have said, that is astonishingly, that is so, look at the prosperity God has given you. Look at the gift God has given you. But when I was fast-forwarded into my actual life 10 years later, it didn't feel rich. It's a really amazing thing that happens, Pathway. And I'm going to guess that my story is no different from some of the journey that many of you have walked in. I've noticed something in my life that's an incredibly powerful spiritual principle that I want you to know about and wrestle through today. And it's this, that the definition of rich will always move until God changes your heart. What I learned was that it didn't matter what salary I made. It didn't matter what kind of house I lived in. It didn't matter what kind of car I drove. That there would always be this mythical thing called rich. And that mythical thing would be somewhere out in front of me. And I wasn't there yet. And that if I wasn't careful, I could spend my days chasing this mythical moving line. This definition of rich that was always in front of where I was at any given moment. I'm going to guess that my story is really no different than yours and your family and what you've walked through in your life. Maybe at some point, maybe there actually is a number where whoever makes that number automatically feels, I'm rich. But the truth is that for almost every one of us, we look at our lives, no matter where we're at, no matter what kind of job we have, and there's always something more. There's always more potential vacations. There's always a potential upgrade to the house. There's always a bigger house that could be bought. There's always a nicer, faster car. There's always more that we could chase after. Well, Pathway, today I want to welcome you to week number 2 of this series that we're calling Chasing Carrots. This is a series that was first done by Life Church and Pastor Craig Rochelle. We're grateful to them to allow us to borrow their series and kind of rework it and make it our own. And today I want to talk to you about chasing the carrot of wealth. To help you to understand this, it's probably helpful if I define for you, when we use that word carrot, what do we actually mean by it? When we say that we've entitled this series Chasing Carrots, what do we actually mean by it? What is a carrot? Well, let me just define what a carrot is for just a second to maybe help you to wrap your head around it. A carrot, at its core, is a good gift that when wrongly pursued can take the place of God. A carrot is actually a good thing that God provides, a good gift of God. The problem is not the existence of the carrot. The problem is that sometimes the pursuit of the carrot overtakes the pursuit of God in our lives. Last weekend, on week number 1 of the series, I talked to you about chasing the carrot of fame. We talked about the fact that, in all of our lives, we can have a tendency to pursue even sort of micro areas of fame, getting our name known, having people celebrate us, having people kind of lift us up and praise us, being widely celebrated and praised. All of us can fall into the temptation, if we're not careful, of chasing the carrot of fame. Now, I told you last week that fame is not a bad thing. In fact, you could make the biblical argument that fame is actually a gift from God. God handed out fame to King David and made the nations fear him, and everybody revered his name. Fame wasn't bad. But the pursuit of fame, the running after fame, the chasing of the carrot of fame can eventually, if we're not careful, replace the chasing after God. Can't it? And this is what carrots can do. Carrots are good gifts. They're things that God provides to us out of his love and his mercy toward us. But when they're wrongly pursued, they can overtake our pursuit of God. They can replace him in our lives. And wealth and possessions and stuff is one of the most common carrots for us to chase after in our lives. Man, oh man, we have got to be careful of the pursuit of wealth. And so I'm going to ask you the question again that I opened up this message with. Do you feel rich? Do you? I want you to really wrestle with that question today. And here's why I want to wrestle with that question. Because I want to make the argument for you that whether you feel rich or not right now, whether you can raise your hand and say, I feel rich or not, you are. You are. You may not realize this, but let me just give you some statistical data to help you understand this. This is some data that doesn't come from me. I didn't make it up. It comes from the United Nations. Here's what the United Nations says about the world. 50% of the world population lives on $2.50 a day or less. Let me do some math for you. $2.50 a day comes out to $75 a month. $75 a month comes out to $900 a year. Let me ask you the question again. Do you feel rich? When I started out at my first salary, right out of college, my first salaried position, and I was making $20,000 a year, let me tell you that statistically speaking, by comparison to half the people who live on this earth, who call planet Earth their home, by comparison to half of the people in this world, I was monumentally, off the charts, astonishingly rich when that was my salary. But isn't it interesting that it didn't take me long to find its limits and to stop feeling rich? Pathway. I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. The good news is this. You're rich. You're rich. You're rich. That's the good news. You don't have to chase the carrot of wealth. You've already gotten a hold of it. You've already grabbed your hands on it. You are rich. You were born into the most wealthy, prosperous country in the world, the country that had the greatest economic opportunity of any place on earth that you were born into. You already are rich. But I've got some bad news for you. And the bad news is this. You're rich. And the reality is that when we're rich, we very quickly stop feeling rich and can start pursuing much more riches, and it can quickly overtake God. You see, having lots and lots of wealth, which is what we have by comparison to the rest of the world, it's what we have in our hands as Americans. By having lots and lots of wealth, it can create a spiritual slide for us. It can be our spiritual downfall if we're not incredibly careful to make sure that we are never chasing after the carrot of wealth. This morning, I want to take you into the scriptures. I want to take you in a little journey in the Bible and read for you some words that came from one of the wisest people who ever lived on the planet. I want to read for you out of the book of Ecclesiastes from a guy named Solomon. To give you a little backstory on Solomon to help you to understand the significance of what he wrote. Solomon was literally the wisest person and most likely the richest person who has ever lived on the face of the planet. The story of Solomon is unpacked in 1st and 2nd Samuel and Chronicles. It's unpacked in those books of the Bible. And Solomon was the son of the most famous king in Israelites' history, who was King David. We talked a little bit about King David last week in our message. King David was the second king in Israel's lineage, and Solomon was the third king in the lineage of kings for the nation of Israel. Well, when Solomon was coming into the kingship, when he was a very young man, and he's walking into the first time in his life when he's about to take power, he's about to take the reins of power in his nation, God shows up to him in a dream. God established a relationship with Solomon, and God speaks to Solomon in a dream, and he says to Solomon, he says, Solomon, I want you to ask anything in my name, and I will bless you. You ask anything in my name, and I'm going to make a commitment to you that I will give it to you. Now, at that moment, Solomon could have asked for as much fame as his father David. He could have asked for all the wealth in the world. He could have asked for the greatest, biggest empire to control the superpower of the earth at that time in the nation of Israel. God would have given it to him. But Solomon made an incredibly interesting request. He said, God, I don't have what it takes to govern these people, the Israelites. So God, would you give me wisdom so that I could govern well? When God heard Solomon's request, God was blown away at the heart of Solomon. It's almost like you get the sense that God sort of took God's breath away. He couldn't believe that Solomon had asked this. And so God said to Solomon, because you didn't ask me for fame, wealth, prosperity, not only am I going to give you what you asked for, I'm going to give you so much wisdom, Solomon, but I'm also going to give you fame and wealth and prosperity. And that's what Solomon was given. And so Solomon in his day, several thousand years ago, was this extraordinarily powerful and wealthy and super wise king. He wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. He wrote the book Song of Songs in our Old Testament. He wrote most of the book of Proverbs in our Old Testament. And Solomon was phenomenally rich. And in his writings, in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, he deals with the topic of wealth a lot. It comes up a lot. And it makes sense that it comes up because he had so much wealth, and he had the wisdom to explain the challenges and the problems of wealth. And I want to read for you some statements from Solomon that come out of Ecclesiastes chapter 5, where he deals with this issue of wealth and what it can do to us spiritually, particularly if we chase after it, if it's a carrot that we are constantly running after in our lives. Solomon's going to give us some warnings about wealth. He says this in chapter 5, verse 10. He says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. He said, this too is meaningless. Well, doesn't that just kind of sound like the story I just told you about my own life? That at every moment when my salary increased, at every moment when I was given a pay increase, I figured out a way to find the limits of that money, and suddenly it didn't feel rich anymore. Solomon said, whoever loves money is going to discover that there's never enough to go around. Whoever loves possessions will discover there's never enough of them. The house could always be bigger. The kitchen could always be newer. The car could always be nicer. The car could always be faster. The vacation could always be bigger. The income could always be higher. There's always, 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 always more. Solomon says, here's the deal. You've got to be careful. Because when you have wealth, if you start to love wealth and pursue wealth, you will never in your life reach a place of satisfaction. And I got to tell you, Pathway, that these words mean something to me because around 2014, God had to do this work in me to help me to recognize that the line of rich was always moving on me. It was always moving on me. And it would always continue to move on me until God dealt with something in my heart. God has to deal with something in your heart as well because the line of riches is always, always, always going to move. Solomon goes on and he says these words. He continues on right in the same passage. Let's jump down 2 verses to verse 12. This is interesting. He said, the sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether they eat little or much. But as for the rich, he said, their abundance permits them no sleep. Isn't that interesting? He said, in my wisdom, when I look out on the world and what I see, he said, I see people who the world might look at as sort of common laborers, not rich people. And he said, but the sleep of those people is very, very sweet. They go out, they do their work, they maybe gather up the grain in the fields and then take that grain back to the rich people who own the fields, and they labor, and they don't make much doing it. But when they lay their head down on their pillow at night, they don't worry. But Solomon said, for those who have an abundance, for those who have a great deal of wealth, a great deal of possessions, there's a constant state of worry. Pathway, isn't that true? Come on now, isn't that true? When you acquire something great in your life, a great possession in your life, you may find yourself starting to worry about it. You buy a boat, the boat's awesome, you can't wait to take it out on the river, and then you park the boat and you worry about somebody stealing it. You start to lose sleep. Your house gets bigger, you start to worry about somebody trying to break into it. Your wealth grows, you start to worry about somebody trying to take it out of your hands, somebody trying to take advantage of you. The abundance that we have, if we're not careful, if we're chasing the carrot of wealth, can actually rob us of our sleep and our joy in our lives. Solomon goes on and he says this, jumping right down to verse 13. He said, I've seen a grievous evil under the sun, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners. You know, Pathway, I've got to tell you that I have so found this to be true in my life. You know, what's really interesting, and I've always been burdened by this, and I'm just giving you some self-exposure here to just let you know that I'm normal, I'm like you, I wrestle with the chasing of the carrot of wealth like anybody else in this world. But let me tell you that when I first came into campus ministry, when I first had that first entry-level salary position with the organization that I worked for, I had no problem tithing. Here at Pathway, we teach the tithe. The principle of the tithe is that we take a tenth. The word tithe literally means a tenth. We take a tenth of what we have, and we worship God by giving a tenth toward the kingdom of heaven. Now, we practice that as a church. We give a tenth of our resources away to others, other organizations, other people that need help. And we try to teach people in our church to tithe, to take a tenth of their resources and give them to God, right? It's a biblical principle. What's fascinating is that when I was in that first position with the organization, not only did I tithe, I super tithed. I gave way more than a tenth. It didn't bother me. It's almost like I felt like I was making so much money, so little money that it didn't matter, right? And I just wasn't burdened by it. But I got to just be honest with you for a second. At every moment when my salary stepped up and kicked up and kicked up and kicked up, at every moment that it happened, tithing got a little harder. Now, we've been faithful. Janet and I have been faithful in the tithe for years. We have tithed our entire marriage, and I've got so many stories of God blessing and honoring that process. But I'm just being really honest with you. As the salary has grown, as wealth has grown, as the possessions have grown, tithing's gotten a little more challenging. And I say that because what Solomon says, he says there's a grievous evil that eventually, if you have so much wealth, that wealth can be hoarded to the harm of its owner. He says that it can almost become like you gotta hold on to everything, you gotta wrap it up and grab it and not be generous with it. It gets harder the more you have. Now, Pathway, I tell you all this just to give you the warnings of Solomon. But here's the thing: Solomon also says, you know what though? Wealth is a gift. He says this in chapter 5, verse 19. He says, moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, he says this is a gift from God. So understand what Solomon is saying here. He's saying, look, wealth is a good gift. It's a good gift from God. But he's saying at the same time, but don't run after it. Because if you run after it, you're going to want to hoard it. If you run after it, you're going to lose sleep over it. If you run after it, you're never going to be satisfied with it. And it will do spiritual damage to your life. What is a carrot, Pathway? A carrot is a good gift that when wrongly pursued can take the place of God. And the pursuit of wealth can overtake us and take the place of God. It can become our God. Even as Jesus following, Christ following people, we can chase the carrot of wealth. Pathway, listen to me. Wealth is not something to be embarrassed by. Wealth is not something to be ashamed of. Wealth is not something to be run from. God gives out wealth. Solomon literally says it's a gift of God when God hands out wealth. And here's the deal. Every one of us have been given this gift from God. We're Americans. Now, I don't want to diminish, in all honesty, I don't want to diminish. If you're in a very hurting financial position right now, particularly because of the coronavirus shutdown, I don't want to diminish that. So please don't hear me making light of the difficulties you're facing. I'm not meaning to do that. I'm just trying to help us understand that by perspective to the rest of the world, to the other 50% of the world who is living on $900 in an entire year, God has given us a gift. We don't need to be ashamed of it. We don't need to be embarrassed by it. But Pathway, we also can't chase it. Because if we chase this carrot, ultimately it will end up taking the place of God. And it will destroy us. Pathway, we can't chase the carrot of wealth. The feeling, the definition of being rich is always a moving line, and it will always be a moving line until God deals with something in our heart. You know, the topic of wealth is a biblical topic that runs Old Testament and New all over the Bible. People write about wealth and the challenges of wealth. Jesus teaches a lot about wealth. The Apostle Paul writes about wealth in the New Testament. Solomon talks about it. It's all over the Bible from beginning to end. It's a mega subject, if you will, in the Scriptures. And about 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul was writing to this young pastor named Timothy and was trying to help Timothy to pastor people in his church well. And he writes to Timothy at the end of the book of 1 Timothy chapter 6, he writes to Timothy about how to pastor rich people. And you know, as I read it, I feel like Paul's writing right to me because I'm realizing, you know what? I'm pastoring rich people. We are rich people. The good news is that we're rich. We've already grabbed the carrot. God has already given us the gift of wealth. And so as Paul writes these words to Timothy that I'm about to read to you, I feel like he's almost as if he's writing to me and giving me a charge on how to pastor you as a church. And so I want to read for you Paul's words written to Timothy about 2,000 years ago. He says, Timothy, verse 17 of chapter 6, he says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment." He goes on in verse 18, he says, "Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share." And so, Pathway, I want to respond as if Paul had written this letter to me and said, "Ryan, here's how I want you to pastor the rich people in your church, the Americans in your church, the people who have been so overwhelmingly blessed with the gift of wealth from their Heavenly Father." And I want to respond to Paul's words. Pathway, don't be arrogant in your wealth. That's what Paul literally says to Timothy, that Timothy was supposed to say to his church. So I say it to you, don't be arrogant in your wealth. Pathway, don't put your hope in wealth. It is so uncertain. It's so uncertain. Pathway, put your hope in God because He gives us everything. God is our Father. He is our Lord. He's our King. Let's follow Him and worship Him and not the allure of wealth. Pathway, I have these words for you. Paul said, command them to do good and be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. So I say the same to you. Pathway, be generous. Be willing to share. Don't do what Solomon said is so easy to do, which is to hoard our wealth and hold on to it and not want to share it and not want to give it away and to worry about it and lose sleep over it. Don't do that. Pathway, be rich. Be rich, be rich in good deeds toward God. And be open-handed with the wealth that God has blessed you with and that God has put into those hands. You see, Pathway, the definition of rich will always move in your life until God changes your heart. And I want to invite you into a life that God has had to work so much on me on to walk into, which is a life of no longer chasing wealth, a life of genuine satisfaction and joy in the gift of what God has given us, a life of pursuit of God, but not the pursuit of the carrot of wealth.